There is a moment in the Pacific War that veterans described with a kind of disbelief that never fully went away. A Japanese infantry unit, well-trained, combat-hardened, positioned behind cover, suddenly starts taking fire, but something is wrong. The fire is too accurate, too sustained, too precise. It is not coming in quick single shots the way a bolt-action rifle sounds. It is coming in controlled, deliberate bursts, each one landing exactly where the shooter intended, from a range that should have been impossible. And then the realization hits. That is a machine gun, being fired like a sniper rifle, and whoever is behind it knows exactly what they are doing that moment. That terrifying realization happened more than once across the islands of the Pacific. It happened on Guadalcanal, it happened on Peleliu, it happened on Iwo Jima, and every time it happened it left Japanese soldiers questioning everything they thought they understood about how Americans fought. Because the United States Marine Corps had turned one of the most fearsome weapons of suppressive fire in the history of warfare into something almost surgical, something almost impossible, and the story of how they did it, why they did it, and what it meant for the outcome of the war in the Pacific is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated stories of American military ingenuity ever told. If you respect the men who crossed those beaches and took those islands yard by bloody yard, type Semper Fi in the comments right now. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones that deserve to be remembered. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with the weapon itself. The Browning M1917 and its successor, the M1919, were water-cooled and air-cooled medium machine guns respectively, chambered in the same .30 caliber cartridge as the standard American rifle of the era. The M1919A4 in particular became the workhorse of Marine infantry units across the Pacific campaign. It weighed about 31 pounds without its tripod. With the tripod, you were looking at closer to 50 pounds of steel and mechanism that needed to be carried, set up, fed, and maintained in some of the most brutal terrain on the face of the earth, from the suffocating jungle heat of Guadalcanal to the black volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. By conventional military doctrine of the era, a machine gun was a suppression weapon. You did not aim a machine gun the way you aimed a rifle. You swept it, you laid down a wall of fire. You kept enemy heads down while your own infantry maneuvered. You denied ground. You created what military planners called a beaten zone, a stretch of terrain so thoroughly saturated with fire that nothing could move through it. That was what machine guns were for. That was how every major military in the world used them. That was the doctrine. The Marines read the doctrine, and then, in the crucible of actual combat in the Pacific, certain men decided the doctrine was not enough. To understand why, you need to understand the specific problem that Marine units faced on island after island beginning in 1942. The Japanese were extraordinarily skilled at fortification, not the kind of fortification that means building big walls or digging wide trenches. Japanese defensive engineering was intimate, precise, and devastating. A Japanese rifle platoon defending a position did not spread out in a wide line. They built mutually supporting fighting positions, often just a few feet wide, carved into hillsides woven between tree roots, covered with logs and packed earth, positioned so that attacking any one position exposed the attacker to fire from 2 or 3 others. On Guadalcanal, these were called spider holes and bunker complexes buried so deep in jungle that American units sometimes walked within yards of them before the defenders opened fire. On Peleliu, the Japanese commander General Inoue had taken this concept even further, ordering his men to abandon the old doctrine of defending the beaches and instead turn the island's interior ridgelines, particularly a formation the Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge, into an interconnected labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and firing positions that could absorb artillery fire, absorb naval bombardment, and still pour accurate rifle and machine gun fire onto any American unit that tried to advance. On Iwo Jima, General Kuribayashi refined the concept further still, constructing over 11 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of hardened positions, all designed around the principle of making the island cost the Americans the maximum possible number of lives for every yard of ground. Against this kind of defense, conventional suppressive fire had serious limitations. You could sweep a hillside with machine gun fire all day long. If the Japanese were in properly constructed fighting positions, that fire was hitting rock and dirt and packed earth, not the men behind it. To actually kill the defenders, to actually reduce a position, you needed to put rounds through apertures, through the narrow slits and openings of firing positions, through the gaps between cover. You needed accuracy. You needed precision. You needed, in effect, to use your machine gun as something it was never originally designed to be. Some Marines figured out how to do exactly that. The key insight was this. The Browning machine gun, for all that it was designed as a suppression weapon, was mechanically capable of extraordinary accuracy when properly used. The .30 caliber round it fired was essentially the same round in the same caliber as the Springfield M1903 and the M1 Garand rifle. The barrel, when it had not been overheated by sustained fire, was accurate at ranges that rivaled a good service rifle, and the tripod, the heavy, cumbersome tripod that made the weapon such a burden to carry through jungle and up volcanic rock, was also a precision instrument. It had traverse and elevation mechanisms. It had a T&E device, traverse and elevation, that allowed the gunner to lock the weapon onto a specific point and fire at that exact point repeatedly with minimal deviation. This was originally designed for indirect fire, for firing over obstacles at pre-registered targets without the gunner necessarily having line of sight, but Marines realized it had another application. If you could get eyes on a Japanese firing position, if you could identify exactly where the aperture was, if you could range the weapon precisely, you could use that T&E mechanism to put round after round through an opening the size of a dinner plate at ranges of 500, 600, even 800 yards or more. Not a sweep, not suppression, a single controlled devastating burst aimed at one specific point. The Marines who mastered this technique were the machine gun crews attached to rifle companies, and the best of them developed a kind of professional expertise that was almost artistic in its precision. They learned to read terrain the way a chess player reads a board, identifying where the Japanese had to be based on where the fire was coming from, where the shadows fell, where the vegetation had been disturbed. They learned the sounds and the visual signatures of different Japanese weapons, so they could distinguish a Type 99 light machine gun from a Type 92 heavy machine gun from a Nambu pistol just by the cadence of the fire. And they learned their own weapon down to the molecular level, the way the barrel heated and how that affected point of impact, the way different ammunition lots performed slightly differently, the way the tripod legs had to be set on different types of soil to prevent creep during sustained fire. The result was a capability that the Japanese had no doctrine to deal with, because they had not believed it was possible. Let us talk about the specific tactical situations where this played out, because the abstract description of the technique does not capture the reality of what it meant on the ground in actual combat. On Guadalcanal in late 1942, Marine units fighting to hold Henderson Field encountered Japanese infantry attacks that were unlike anything in the American military's recent experience. The Japanese army of that era was supremely confident in its infantry, and that confidence was earned. Japanese soldiers were tough, disciplined, and willing to accept casualties that would have broken most other armies. Their night attacks in particular were terrifying in their ferocity. Units would press forward through defensive fire that was killing dozens of their men, closing to close quarters, because Japanese doctrine at that stage of the war placed enormous faith in the bayonet and in the psychological effect of screaming, close-range assault on defenders. Marine machine gun crews defending the Henderson perimeter quickly discovered that the conventional machine gun tactic of sweeping fire across the front of an attack, while certainly lethal, was not precise enough to deal with Japanese units that were willing to accept those losses and keep coming. What stopped the attacks was not sweeping fire. What stopped them was the ability to identify specific points of concentrated enemy force and put rounds exactly on those points with enough accuracy to destroy the leadership and firepower concentrated there. Sergeant Mitchell Page, who would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on the night of October 26, 1942, demonstrated this principle in one of the most remarkable individual combat actions of the Pacific War. When the Marines around him were killed or wounded and Japanese forces had broken through the perimeter, Page did not simply sweep fire across the jungle in front of him. He moved from gun to gun among the positions of fallen Marines, keeping fire going in coordinated, controlled bursts, identifying the specific locations of enemy concentration and directing fire onto the locations with the deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what his weapon could do. The Japanese assault, which should by every calculation have overwhelmed the remaining defenders, was stopped. Page walked out of that position carrying a machine gun and leading a bayonet charge, something that still sounds like fiction 7 decades later. What Page and men like him understood was that a machine gun in the hands of a gunner who truly knew what he was doing was not a blunt instrument. It was a precision instrument that happened to be capable of very high rates of fire. On Peleliu, the terrain made this understanding literally a matter of survival for attacking Marine units in ways that almost defied description to anyone who had not been there. The Immerbergal Pocket, the series of ridges and caves that the Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge, presented a defensive problem that had no clean solution. The caves in those ridges were positioned so that the only approaches were covered by fire from multiple positions simultaneously. You could not simply assault one cave because doing so exposed you to fire from 3 others. You could not simply suppress one position, because the defenders would pull back into the tunnel system and let your fire exhaust itself against rock, then come back to the firing aperture when you tried to advance. What worked painfully and at terrible cost was the combination of direct fire from every weapon that could be brought to bear on specific apertures and covered approaches, used in coordination so that the moment defenders showed themselves, rounds were already going exactly where those defenders had to be. Marines machine gun teams on Peleliu to work in pairs with observers who had better lines of sight to specific positions. The observer would watch the aperture or the crevice or the firing slit, and the moment a Japanese soldier showed any part of himself, he would call the adjustment and the gunner would put a burst through that exact opening. This was not spray and pray. This was calculated, patient, precise work carried out under conditions of extreme physical stress, extreme heat, extreme danger, with Japanese snipers specifically targeting American machine gun crews because Japanese commanders understood that those crews were the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. The Marines on Peleliu went through machine gun barrels at rates that horrified supply officers, not because the guns were malfunctioning, but because the crews were maintaining such sustained, controlled, precise fire that the barrels were wearing out faster than the supply system had anticipated. That fact alone tells you something about the nature of the fighting and the nature of the technique being employed. On Iwo Jima, the technique reached what might be called its most refined expression. Though refined is a strange word to use for anything that happened on that island, Iwo Jima was unique among the major Pacific battles in that the terrain offered almost no natural cover for the attacking Marines. The beaches were black volcanic ash that swallowed your boots and made every step an effort. The inland terrain was broken rock and scrub, pocked with the openings of Japanese fighting positions that blended into the landscape so effectively that you could sometimes not see them until you were close enough that the defenders inside could practically reach out and touch you. General Kuribayashi's defensive system was designed around interlocking fields of fire. Every position covered at least two others. Destroying one position in isolation did not reduce the threat, it reduced the interlocking coverage of other positions only marginally because the system was designed with redundancy. To actually reduce a position, you had to suppress every position that covered it simultaneously while infantry closed and destroyed it at close range. That meant precision fire from multiple weapons onto multiple specific targets at the same moment, sustained long enough for the infantry to move, hold, and consolidate. Marine machine gun teams on Iwo Jima operated in what their officers described as almost a sniper role, positioned to achieve long sight lines across the terrible terrain, used not for suppression in the conventional sense, but for the deliberate destruction of specific point targets while rifle platoons maneuvered. The teams would identify a position, range it, confirm the adjustment, and then fire controlled short bursts through the aperture while infantry worked around the flanks. This sounds almost clinical described this way. It was not clinical. The men doing this were working under fire from positions they had not yet identified, in temperatures that in the later weeks of the battle dropped low enough at night to cause serious cold casualties, breathing air that carried the smell of sulfur from volcanic vents in the rock beneath them, watching friends die yards away, and doing all of this while maintaining the kind of focused technical precision that the technique required. The psychological demands alone would have broken most people. The Marines on Iwo Jima simply added it to the list of things they had to do and kept working. The Japanese response to this technique evolved over the course of the Pacific Campaign in ways that are themselves revealing. Early in the war, Japanese tactical doctrine did not specifically address the possibility that American machine gun crews would use their weapons in this precise, almost sniper-like manner. Japanese defensive planning assumed that machine guns would be used for suppression, and defensive positions were designed to be resistant to suppression, specifically to allow defenders to sit out a burst of sweeping fire and then come back to their apertures. The idea that the machine gun fire itself might be accurate enough to come through the aperture was not built into the original defensive calculations. As the campaign progressed and after-action reports filtered back to Japanese commanders, this changed. Japanese engineers began designing apertures differently, angling them to reduce the direct line of sight through them, adding baffles inside the firing positions to prevent rounds that did enter the aperture from traveling the full depth of the position, constructing secondary positions behind primary ones so that even if a primary aperture was defeated, the defenders could fall back to another firing position and continue the fight. The fact that Japanese defensive engineering had to evolve specifically to deal with this technique is perhaps the clearest possible evidence of how real the threat was. You do not redesign your fortifications to counter something that is not actually working. Japanese soldiers who were captured, which in the Pacific War was relatively rare given the Japanese military culture around surrender, described in interrogation, reports a specific and consistent fear about American machine gun fire that went beyond the normal fear of any weapon. The precision of it was what they found most psychologically disturbing. An attacking infantry unit can advance under suppressive fire if the unit maintains its discipline, because suppressive fire covers ground indiscriminately, and the advancing soldier's chance of being in the exact wrong place at the exact wrong time can be managed through movement technique. What you cannot manage through movement technique is a gunner who has identified your specific position and is putting rounds through your specific aperture. That is not probability anymore. That is a man who has decided to kill you in particular, and he has the skill and the tool to do it. Several Japanese accounts from survivors of Peleliu and Iwo Jima specifically mention the eerie precision of American automatic fire as a defining feature of the combat experience on those islands. One account, included in a post-war analysis conducted by the Marine Corps, described the experience of watching a firing position defended by two Japanese soldiers destroyed by machine gun fire from a range the Japanese defenders had believed was too great for accurate automatic weapons fire. The two defenders were killed through the aperture of their position, without the position itself being otherwise damaged. The account was written with a kind of clinical horror that comes through even in translation, the horror of a man who understood that something had happened that should not have been possible. Now let us talk about the men who actually developed and executed this technique, because like everything else in the Marine Corps story of the Pacific, it did not come from a manual, it came from individuals. The machine gun section of a Marine rifle company in World War II was a small, close-knit group of men who lived with their weapon around the clock. They maintained it, carried it, fed it ammunition in combat, and spent every available moment of non-combat time training with it. In a rifle company that might have 200 men, the machine gun section might number a dozen, and within that dozen, the relationship between the gunner and his assistant gunner was one of the most intimate working relationships in the military. The assistant gunner's primary job in sustained fire was to manage the ammunition, feeding the belted rounds into the receiver, watching for jams, ensuring the feed was smooth, watching the barrel for signs of overheating. But in the precise fire technique that evolved in the Pacific, the assistant gunner took on an additional role that was almost identical to the role of a spotter for a sniper team. He watched the target area through binoculars or a spotting scope when available, called the fall of shot, and told the gunner what adjustment was needed to bring rounds onto the exact point of aim. This partnership required a level of communication and mutual understanding that went beyond simple training. The two men had to know each other's instincts and habits well enough that verbal communication in the noise of battle could be reduced to the minimum, because in the Pacific, noise discipline around a firing position could be literally the difference between life and death. Japanese counter-battery tactics specifically targeted the sound of American automatic weapons fire, and a machine gun crew that was too vocal in coordinating fire might draw a mortar round before they finished the engagement. The gunners who became most skilled at the precise fire technique tended to share certain characteristics that their peers and surviving officers noted consistently in accounts written after the war. They were patient. In a combat environment that pushed every human being toward maximum urgency, the best machine gun crews maintained a deliberateness that seemed almost impossible. They would wait. They would watch. They would resist the impulse to open fire before they had achieved the precise aim that the situation required, even while taking fire themselves, even while Marines around them were being hit. They were technically obsessive in the way that certain craftsmen become obsessive about the details of their craft. They knew their weapons down to the last spring and pin. They could diagnose a malfunction by sound without looking at the mechanism. They knew exactly how their specific weapon differed from the ideal specification, and they compensated for those differences automatically. One former machine gun section leader recalled after the war that his best gunner could tell you the approximate round count through that particular barrel by the way the weapon felt on sustained fire, and used that information to manage his rate of fire to keep the barrel in its optimal accuracy. Band, that is not training, that is mastery, and they were, without exception, men of extraordinary calm under fire. The precise fire technique required the gunner to remain functionally still, mentally focused, mechanically precise, in circumstances where every human instinct screamed at him to move, to take cover, to do anything except sit behind a gun and carefully aim at a specific point while bullets were coming the other way. The men who could do that were not fearless. Every account makes clear that they were afraid. They had simply learned, through training and through the brutal education of actual combat, to perform their function at the same level regardless of the fear. The weapon itself deserves more attention, because the technical characteristics of the Browning M1919 that made this technique possible were not accidents. John Moses Browning, who designed the original 1917 pattern, was one of the most gifted firearms engineers in history, and the gun he produced was a model of mechanical reliability and functional accuracy that his contemporaries recognized as exceptional. The bolt design, the feed system, the barrel locking mechanism, all of these were engineered to tolerances that produced consistent performance under the kind of sustained use that would have destroyed a less carefully designed weapon. The .30 caliber cartridge itself was a significant factor. The .30-06 Springfield cartridge, which the M1919 fired, was a high-velocity, aerodynamically efficient round that maintained accuracy at distances well beyond what most people associate with a belt-fed automatic weapon. At 500 yards, a properly aimed burst from an M1999 on a stable tripod would produce a shot group that any service rifle shooter would recognize as respectable. At that range, a Japanese fighting position aperture was a viable target for a skilled crew using the T&E mechanism correctly. The tripod, specifically the M2 tripod that was standard equipment for M999 operations, was engineered with a degree of precision that is sometimes overlooked when people think about crew-served weapons. The traversing and elevating mechanism was designed to allow adjustments of fractions of a degree, movements that translated at 500 yards into adjustments of just a few inches. In the hands of a crew that had ranged their target correctly and understood the mechanism, that level of adjustment made the difference between hitting an aperture and missing it. The ammunition also played a role. The Marine Corps in the Pacific War had access to armor-piercing .30 caliber ammunition in addition to standard ball, and for engaging hardened positions, the AP round had obvious advantages. Its harder core penetrated light cover that would have deflected a standard ball round, and for engaging the heavy timber and packed earth of typical Japanese fighting positions, the difference was meaningful. Crews that were serious about precision fire would carry a mix of ammunition types and select the appropriate round for the target they were engaging, another indication of the deliberate, thoughtful approach to the weapon that characterized the most effective crews. The organizational context also matters. The Marine Corps of World War II was, by any fair assessment, one of the most capable infantry fighting organizations in history. The institutional culture that produced men capable of developing and executing the precise machine gun technique was not an accident. It was the product of decades of institutional development, a culture that valued individual competence and initiative within a framework of absolute discipline, and a training system that pushed men hard enough to reveal who could actually perform under pressure before those men went into combat. Marine basic training in the early 1940s was notably more rigorous than Army basic training by the standards of the era, and Marine advanced infantry training pushed further still. Every Marine rifleman qualified on the rifle range to a standard that was, at the time, considered quite high. Marine machine gun crews trained not just to operate their weapons, but to understand them, to troubleshoot them, and to employ them with tactical judgment, rather than simply following a prescribed script. The institutional culture also tolerated, even encouraged, the kind of on-the-spot adaptation that produced the precise fire technique. The Marine Corps of that era had a deep suspicion of rigid doctrine applied without thought to conditions that doctrine had not anticipated, and junior officers and NCOs were expected to solve the problems in front of them with the tools they had rather than waiting for higher headquarters to tell them what to do. That culture created the conditions in which a machine gun crew on Guadalcanal or Peleliu could look at a problem that conventional doctrine did not address and invent a solution on the spot. The ripple effects of this technique extended beyond the immediate tactical situations in which it was employed. The reputation that Marine machine gun crews developed among Japanese forces for extraordinary accurate automatic fire had a psychological effect that multiplied the actual physical effect of the fire. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific who knew they were facing Marine units knew or came to know that American automatic weapons fire was not the predictable, sweeping suppressive fire that doctrine said it would be. It might be sweeping, or it might be something else entirely, something that found you specifically through cover that should have protected you from distances that should have put you beyond its effective reach. That uncertainty is psychologically corrosive in a way that is hard to overstate. A soldier who knows exactly what the enemy's fire can do can calculate risk and manage movement accordingly. A soldier who is not sure whether the next burst of fire will sweep harmlessly past him or will put rounds precisely through the 6-inch gap in his cover has no reliable framework for that calculation. He either moves in ways that are more cautious than the tactical situation may require, which slows everything down and reduces his own unit's effectiveness. Or he moves normally and accepts a level of risk that may in fact be far higher than he realizes. Japanese unit cohesion in sustained defensive actions against Marine units showed signs of this kind of psychological pressure in ways that are visible in the historical record even across the language barrier. Units that maintained excellent discipline and cohesion in the early phases of an engagement against Marine forces sometimes showed accelerating deterioration in later phases that correlated with sustained exposure to precise automatic fire, even when their positions had not been physically reduced. The fire itself, the sustained, targeted, impossible-seeming accuracy of it, was doing damage to the unit's mental coherence beyond whatever physical damage it was inflicting. The flip side of this was the psychological effect on the Marine riflemen who were working in coordination with effective machine gun sections. In the Pacific, where the terrain and the Japanese defensive system made the cost of every advance brutally visible, knowing that you had machine gun support you could actually count on, not just to suppress but to destroy specific targets with precision, changed what was tactically possible for the rifle platoons working forward. Marine infantry officers in the Pacific consistently rated their machine gun sections among the most valuable assets available to them, which in the resource-constrained environment of island fighting was saying something. When you are working against prepared positions in terrain that limits your ability to maneuver, the ability to put precise, sustained fire on a specific target is not a nice-to-have. It is the thing that makes the difference between a successful assault and a failed one that costs you a third of your platoon. The technique also had implications for how Marine commanders thought about fire and maneuver at the small unit level. The fire and maneuver doctrine of the era said roughly that one element of an infantry unit provides fire while another maneuver, then they switch. The fire's element's job was suppression, keeping enemy heads down long enough for the maneuvering element to move. In conventional doctrine, the emphasis was on volume of fire because volume of fire was what created suppression. But in the Pacific, with Japanese defenders in hardened positions who could sit out suppression and come back to their firing positions the moment American infantry lifted its head, a different model sometimes applied. The fire's element's job in those situations was not suppression but destruction, using precise fire to actually kill the defenders in specific positions rather than merely keeping them down, which created a fundamentally different dynamic for the maneuvering element. Instead of moving under the cover of fire that was keeping the enemy's head down temporarily, the rifle platoon was moving against positions that had been actually reduced, where the immediate threat had been destroyed rather than merely suppressed. That is a categorically different tactical situation, and it explains why Marine units in the Pacific sometimes moved with what seemed like a confidence that outside observers found almost bewildering, given the difficulty of the terrain and the strength of the Japanese defenses. The confidence was not bravado. It was a rational response to having weapons in the hands of people who knew how to use them in ways that actually reduced the threat rather than just managing it. The specific weapons used evolved over the course of the Pacific campaign as supply and availability changed. The MY91A4 remained the primary weapon, but Marine units in the later Pacific campaigns also had access to the MY19A6, a lightened version with a bipod that could be carried and employed more like a standard light machine gun while retaining most of the accuracy characteristics of the tripod-mounted A4. The A6 represented a different employment model, less suitable for the extended precise fire of the tripod-mounted gun but more flexible in the fluid combat of late-war Pacific fighting where the defensive lines were sometimes more complex and the distances more variable. The 50 caliber M2 Browning, a completely different weapon in a completely different class, also appeared increasingly in Marine hands as the war progressed, and some of the precise fire techniques developed on 30 caliber weapons were adapted with modifications to the 50 caliber platform. The 50 caliber round's ballistic performance at extended ranges was significantly superior to the 30 caliber, and against heavier Japanese positions, the penetrating power of the 50 caliber was a meaningful advantage. Machine gun crews who had mastered the precise fire approach on the M1919 brought that understanding with them when they transitioned to the M2, which is itself a tribute to the degree to which the technique was a function of the crew's knowledge and skill rather than any specific characteristic of one particular weapon. There were also moments where the technique was improvised in ways that went beyond even the already creative adaptations described above. On Iwo Jima, there are documented accounts of Marine crews establishing what amounted to impromptu counter-sniper positions using machine guns, working with infantry scouts who had identified the locations of Japanese snipers to engage those snipers with precision automatic fire at ranges that would have been considered extreme for rifle-caliber automatic weapons by any conventional standard. The logic was straightforward to the Marines who applied it. If you had identified the location of a sniper, and you had a weapon capable of putting rounds precisely onto that location from a stable platform, the caliber of the weapon and the rate of fire were secondary considerations. You put the rounds where they needed to go. The sniper died. You moved on. That kind of flexible, mission-focused thinking is perhaps the defining characteristic of the Marine Corps culture that produced this technique in the first place. And it is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something important about what the Marine Corps actually was in that era. The Marine Corps in World War II was not a large organization by the standards of the conflict it was fighting in. The Army had millions of men, the Navy had hundreds of ships, the Marine Corps had a few divisions and a reputation. The reputation was built on the twin foundations of individual toughness and collective competence, the idea that every Marine, regardless of specialty, was first a rifleman, and that every Marine unit, regardless of size, was expected to be able to solve problems that larger, better-equipped forces sometimes could not solve. That institutional identity produced, among many other things, machine gun crews who were not satisfied with knowing how to use their weapon in the way the manual described. They wanted to know what else the weapon could do. They pushed the limits of the equipment and of themselves to find those limits, and in the specific brutal environment of Pacific Island fighting, they found capabilities that no one had fully anticipated, and that the enemy they were fighting never successfully countered. The men who did this are mostly gone now. The Pacific War ended more than 80 years ago, and the veterans who carried those guns up those beaches and those ridges have by now almost entirely passed from living memory into history. But what they figured out under fire, in conditions that should have made that kind of creative, precise work impossible, remains one of the more remarkable demonstrations of human ingenuity under pressure in the history of warfare. There is a tendency, when talking about weapons and tactics, to focus on the technology, the gun, the round, the tripod, the T&E mechanism, and those things matter, as this story shows. But what actually drove the development of the precise machine gun technique in the Pacific was not technology, it was people. Specifically, it was a particular kind of person, patient, technically precise, calm under fire, and absolutely committed to finding a solution to the problem in front of them, regardless of whether that solution was in any manual or doctrine, guide. Those are the qualities that make a great NCO in any military. They are also, not coincidentally, the qualities that the Marine Corps has always said it exists to develop. The Pacific War tested that claim in the hardest possible way, on islands whose names became synonymous with sacrifice and ferocity, and on those islands, among the many things that Marine infantry units did that exceeded what anyone had thought possible, the machine gun crews who turned their weapons into precision instruments of destruction under fire earned a place in that story that they have not always received. When Japanese veterans described in interrogation and in post-war accounts the specific fear they felt when they encountered this kind of fire, they were not simply describing respect for an effective weapon. They were describing the recognition that they were facing men who were better at their jobs than the situation had any right to produce. Men who, in the middle of everything that the Pacific War threw at them, had found a way to be more precise, more effective, and more dangerous than anyone had expected them to be. That is the story of the Marine machine gun crews in the Pacific. That is the story of what happens when you take a well-designed weapon, put it in the hands of men who truly understand it, give those men the training and the culture and the freedom to adapt, and send them against a problem that conventional doctrine cannot fully solve. They do not follow the manual. They write a new one in the worst possible classroom, under the worst possible conditions, and they get it right. If this is the first time you have heard this story in any detail, that is not an accident of history. It is one of the many stories from the Pacific that have been overshadowed by the larger narrative of the war, by the campaigns and the command decisions, and the grand strategic movements that get most of the attention. But the war in the Pacific was won by small units of men doing things that were not in the doctrine, solving problems that had no established solution in conditions that should have made careful, creative thinking impossible. The machine gun crews who developed the precise fire technique are one example of that, and one of the clearest examples, because the physical evidence of what they were doing survives in the Japanese fortifications on those islands, in the apertures of positions that were defeated not by masses of spraying fire but by rounds placed with precision, and in the accounts of the men who were on the receiving end and lived to describe what it had felt like. Type Semper Fi in the comments if you made it this far. And if you are not subscribed, now is the time, because there are more stories like this one, Stories about the people and the decisions and the moments of ingenuity that actually determined the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history, and they deserve to be told with the attention they have earned. The machine gunners of the Pacific Marine Corps earned their place in that history on some of the bloodiest ground in the history of American arms. They did it with a weapon that everyone thought they understood, used in a way that almost no one had imagined was possible, and they did it well enough that the men they were fighting against, men who were themselves among the toughest and most disciplined infantry, soldiers in the world at that time, had to redesign their fortifications to try to deal with it. That is the measure of what they accomplished, and that is why it deserves to be remembered.